Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to what is hopefully the first of many videos on the Bella Luna Fishing YouTube page. My name's Antonio, and today we're going to be talking about everything that I learned this spring fishing for northern pike. I've been fishing basically my entire life, and I never really targeted this species, but last spring I accidentally hooked into the largest northern pike I'd ever seen. It weighed about 13 pounds and came in at just under 40 inches in length. And ever since that day, I have been absolutely obsessed with catching these fish. I've rarely targeted anything else. Last year, I caught 4 fish over 10 pounds, and this year I set myself the internal goal of trying to double that by being able to land 8 fish over 10 pounds into my boat. This video is going to document everything that I learned. I fished pretty obsessively as soon as the ice came off the lake in March, all the way up to Memorial Day a couple weeks ago. I did some things right, and I surely did some things wrong. So hopefully this can help everyone just understand some of the patterns that the pike go through as that water temperature warms up, and hopefully help put a couple fish in your boat. So let's go. So here we're going to use Lowrance's CMAP online chart viewer to go over some of the patterns that I've been able to pick up on when spring pike fishing. So we have a typical main lake here. We have a deeper pocket in the middle. We have some shallower surrounding shoreline and a couple steep breaks and contours that we can use. In the winter months, the pike are going to be holding up in the bottom of these deep pockets. And what that does is it isolates them from any weather events that might be happening on the surface. If there's a winter storm and there's wind and rain or snow, that's going to cause some fluctuation in the top of the water column with respect to temperature. But deep down 20 feet, that's going to be isolated. The temperature is not going to change, and the pike are much more comfortable down there. In the springtime, when the ice thaws out, those pike are looking to move up into their spawning zones. And those spawning zones are shallow areas 3 to 5 foot in depth that typically contain a lot of vegetation. So areas like this, usually at the back of shallow bays, is where you want to target. The pike are going to be out in these deeper breaks, and as the sun warms the shallows up, they're going to slowly peruse up into those shallow areas looking for food. Once the sun sets at the end of the day, those shallow areas are going to drop back down 1 to 3 degrees in water temperature, and the pike are then going to migrate back into those deep pockets for the night where they're protected from the elements. The best way to catch these pike in the early ice out, and remember these pike are extremely lethargic as the water temperature is still just above freezing, is you want to try and intersect them as they're on this hunt in the shallows for food. So what I did this spring is I put an anchor on my kayak and I would post up right on the deep part of the drop-offs in the morning. As that water temperature warmed up during the day, I would slowly creep in, maybe re-anchoring, moving to a new spot every 45 minutes to an hour, and by the time it was 1, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I would be on the shallows right where the pike would be. As that sun sets, you then slowly start to work your way back out, and you essentially follow the pike as they're moving and making this little migration into the shallows. This is definitely a slower form of fishing in the winter. The pike are very, very lethargic. I actually was able to find out that pike will actually suspend over 16, 17, 18 feet of water. I would roll up on multiple drop-offs and there would be very large pike sitting there 4 feet under the surface, just trying to get some sun, waiting to warm up enough so they had enough energy to go into the shallows and hunt. Unfortunately, I didn't find a lot of fish in this situation that were actually willing to take a lure or even a dead bait, but nonetheless, very interesting behavior that I witnessed multiple times over the course of the month of March. So the way that I fished for pike during this time of the year was pretty simple. I would have a 2-rod setup where one rod would be a dead bait rod. This rod I would hang a 5 to 6 inch sucker or shiner about 10 inches off the bottom and try and just pick up any fish that were in a scavenging mode down below. My second rod that I was using was a casting rod, and on this rod I would typically use something that I could retrieve very slowly, such as a big soft curly tail, or maybe a jerk bait that I could have a pausing action. I would pause for 3-4 seconds at a time, even just trying to entice a really lethargic fish to take that bait. The mistake that I made in the early spring was I started fishing too shallow too early. I'd always heard that the small male pike move up into the shallows a few weeks before the females, and that definitely seemed to be the case. I could not for the life of me find a pike that would eat a lure that was bigger than 24 inches and about 3 or 4 pounds. They seemed to be plentiful, they seemed to be everywhere, and I could not find the larger females that had moved in. Next year, I really want to make an effort to fish deeper, longer into the year, and try and catch those lurking females on the breaks before they move up shallow. The fishing at this time of year was also painfully slow. I would catch 1 to 2 fish a day, and there was trips where I couldn't even find the pike and resorted to just fishing for rainbow trout just to feel something at the end of my line. It's very tough mentally sitting out in the freezing cold weather bundled up on a kayak for 6-7 hours at a time and not actually getting a fish as a reward. Towards the end of March, I did manage to land a pretty sizable fish off a steep break on the main lake. He was suspended there about 3 or 4 feet underneath the surface and took a jerkbait that was pitched right in front of his nose. It was a nice highlight to the month of March, but I was very much ready for the water to warm up in April. As April came around and the water temperature pushed 40 degrees, there was a pretty significant shift in my approach to how I was targeting the pike. This is Messalonsky Lake. We're back with the CMAP online viewer here, and it's a lake I have a ton of experience with, so I wanted to just go over how I break it down. So you can see Messalonsky is kind of a unique situation because they have a river that runs into the bottom of the lake. There's a channel that comes out and deposits into these large sand flats. Now, what I learned this year is that the river, this yellow channel here, is typically about 2 to 3 degrees cooler than any of the surrounding area. And so because we're so early in the year and the water is still pretty cold, I tried to target those areas as opposed to the channel. So the way that I would approach this is really just a moving game. You're power fishing, you're working the flats, meandering back and forth, trying to find areas of isolated growing grass that's spawning, just trying to find where those pike are staging up. Sometimes they could be 6 to 8 feet deep, sometimes they could be 3 to 5 feet deep. It depended on the day, if there was sun, what the wind was like, but I was targeting big flats where there was a lot of area to roam. This is where the bait fish are going to be in the spring. The pike are going to be trying to chase them down. And again, areas that were real magnets were areas where there was emerging weed growth. You wanted to target the green weeds because that's new growth and it provided a lot of safe haven for the bait fish, which then in turn draws in the pike. I had 2 staple lures during this time, and I'll cover both of those here shortly. So the first one, I'm going to throw up on the screen right now, the Savage Gear Deviator Swim. And I had this lure in a fire tiger pattern, so I think it really resembled a fleeing perch. This lure is incredible. It is a 7-inch jerkbait that is a suspending jerkbait. It allows you to cover a lot of ground really quickly and also allows you to pause that twitching action so that if you do have a follow, you can entice that fish to eat right at the boat by slowing down the presentation. This lure was easily my favorite bait in the early spring. The strikes on the Savage Gear were vicious, and they often came when you paused the retrieve and let the lure sit there for half a second. Ended up catching quite a few fish on this bait throughout the first 2 weeks of April, with the biggest one topping just under 9 pounds. One of the approaches with this bait that I found worked really well was finding new weed growth and just slowly twitching that bait above the weeds, or finding elongated weed edges and pulling the bait slowly along those weed edges, waiting for a strike to come. So the second bait I had a lot of success with in early spring was the Savage Gear Whitefish Shad in a blue and silver pattern. This bait was my search bait. I put a stinger on the bait and I was able to cast it and just reel it across vast amounts of flat looking for fish. The way that I used this was essentially as a scouting technique. If I had a follow on the Whitefish Shad, I would then switch to a deviator or something where I could control the presentation a little bit more, and that resulted in a lot of different follows on the Savage Gear whitefish and then strikes on the Savage Gear deviator. I often had pike following with their nose right on the tail of this swim bait, and it made for some really cool takes boat side, as well as some awesome follow videos that I was able to capture on the GoPro. I was never able to find any monsters with this bait in the month of April, but I was definitely able to catch some nice fish, with the biggest one going in just at above 7 pounds. One of the unexpected benefits of fishing a presentation like this is that pike are not the only thing roaming these large sand flats when the water is around 45 degrees. There are some very big largemouth bass that could not resist a whitefish shad, and I ended up catching multiple fish over the 5 pound mark and almost topping the 6 pound mark as a complete bycatch. As they say, all good things must come to an end, and once that water temperature hit 48, 49 degrees, the bite completely shut off. The pike started spawning, and I actually had some follows where there was multiple male pike circling a female following my bait. But you could tell once this happened that it was almost impossible to catch a fish, many follows, and just nothing was committal. It didn't matter what the presentation was, slow, fast, steady, erratic, the fish would follow the lure, nose to tail, and would never commit. I was even lucky enough to record this in real time using my active target while I was trolling a large swim bait in about 6 or 7 feet of water. I had a pike follow my lure nose to tail for over 4.5 minutes straight without committing to the bite. After going through this mind-numbing experience, I did what any sensible angler would do, and I packed up my rods and my boat, and I went south and didn't fish for 3 weeks straight. When I got back on the water 3 weeks later, you could instantly tell that there was going to be a different attitude from the fish. The water temperature had jumped up 5 degrees, it was now in the mid-50s, and the post-spawn funk had definitely ended. It really surprised me how much vegetation had grown in just those 3 weeks. Beds that before were 3 inches tall had now grown to over a foot, and you could tell that there was bait fish congregating around these spots. It seems like the perfect opportunity to take out a slower presentation again and use either glide or twitch baits. Fished almost exclusively with 2 baits in the first week of May. Again, 2 Savage Gear baits, the Shine Glide and the Deviator Swim. Both of these baits rely on a pretty slow presentation, but allow you a lot of control and are really powerful when fished near weed edges or over on top of weed growth. My approach here relied almost exclusively on finding patches of weeds and then pulling my baits over the top of them. The pike would come shooting out from the bottom and absolutely hammer the bait right underneath the surface. This presentation offered a ton of vicious strikes and put a lot of big fish in my boat, including my first double digit of the year, a 35-inch, 10.2 pound pike. The second week of May came, the water temperatures continued their steady rise, and I started to notice a lot of bait fish schooling around in the shallows. You'll see on the active target here, there's an absolutely gigantic school of alewives, which are located in about 5 or 6 feet of water. These alewives are the primary forage on most of the lakes that I fish, and they bring in all sorts of predators from perch to largemouth bass, smallmouth bass, and then obviously where everything congregates, the pike are going to show up too. After seeing so much bait in the shallows, I kind of figured that we were just on the verge of the peak pike bite, which is about 2 or 3 weeks after the spawn in May. I ended up throwing on the most obnoxious and bright lures that I could in the hopes of enticing something huge. At this point of the season, I had fished for a solid 2 months straight and only had landed 1 fish over 10 pounds, which was about 12% of my goal of 8 on the year. What I didn't really expect was that the next 3 weeks would be the best pike fishing that I'd ever experienced in my entire life. I started out landing a 10-pounder at one of my local spots, which I mistakenly dropped into the water post-weighing and prior to taking a photo of it. So the video will have to do. I then proceeded to rattle off 3 straight days of catching a fish over 10 pounds, with 2 of those fish being over 40 inches and 15 pounds. The last fish I caught was extremely memorable And on an extremely tough day where I battled through pouring rain, I finally got a bite at about 5 p.m., and it was a 16.6-pound monster. Naturally, I saved the best for last. I was lucky enough this season to get the full cast to catch of what ended up being the second biggest pike I've ever caught. Enjoy the video, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in June.
There we go. Oh my God, that's a big fish. Holy shit, that's a big fish. Fuck yeah, baby.